The tiltrotor aircraft screamed through the night sky at 280 miles per hour. Its twin engines pivoted forward in airplane mode as it raced toward coordinates that shouldn't exist on any official map. Inside the cockpit, Staff Sergeant Riley Patterson gripped the controls with hands that had never been trained for this moment, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to keep the massive V-22 Osprey stable in the turbulent mountain air. Behind her, 12 wounded Marines lay unconscious, their lives hanging in the balance as she attempted what every pilot said was impossible, landing a tiltrotor in terrain so hostile that even helicopters had failed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 18 hours earlier, Riley had been elbow deep in a routine engine inspection, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and her mind focused on nothing more complicated than replacing a faulty valve. She was just a maintenance crew, the person who fixed things so the real pilots could fly them. But sometimes, when everything goes wrong and lives are on the line, the person who understands the machine better than anyone else becomes exactly who you need at the controls. The pre-dawn darkness at Marine Corps' Air Station Cherry Point was broken only by the harsh fluorescent lights spilling from Hangar 7, where Staff Sergeant Riley Patterson crouched beneath the port engine nacelle of a V-22 Osprey, her diagnostic tablet casting a blue glow across her concentrated features. The familiar weight of her tool belt and the smell of aviation fuel and metal shavings felt like home after 6 years of working on these complex machines that most people couldn't even pronounce correctly. Riley had always been drawn to things that others found incomprehensible. While her high school classmates in rural Tennessee were focused on football games and Friday night parties, she'd spent her weekends in her father's auto repair shop, learning that every machine had its own language of sounds, vibrations, and subtle warning signs. When the Marine Corps recruiter had mentioned the V-22 Osprey program, describing an aircraft that could take off like a helicopter and fly like a plane, Riley knew she'd found her calling. The Osprey was a marvel of engineering complexity that bridged 2 worlds of flight. Its massive rotors could tilt from horizontal to vertical, allowing it to hover like a helicopter for takeoffs and landings, then rotate forward for the speed and efficiency of a fixed-wing aircraft. Most people saw an intimidating machine with a reputation for being difficult to master. Riley saw a puzzle that revealed its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. "Patterson, how's that port engine looking?" called out Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thompson. The maintenance chief would become something of a mentor to Riley over the past 3 years. Thompson was old-school military, a man who'd worked on everything from CH-46 Sea Knights to UK-1 Cobras, but he'd developed a grudging respect for Riley's intuitive understanding of the Osprey's complex systems. "Hydraulic pressures running a little high on the primary circuit," Riley replied without looking up from her tablet, her fingers dancing across the diagnostic interface. "Nothing critical, but I want to check the relief valve before we sign off on this bird. Could be a sign of impending failure down the line." Thompson nodded approvingly. This was exactly why he trusted Riley with the most complex maintenance issues. Most technicians would have declared the hydraulic system within acceptable parameters and moved on to the next task. Riley understood that acceptable wasn't good enough when Marines' lives depended on these machines performing flawlessly in combat situations. The Osprey they were working on, tail number 168,019, was scheduled for a routine training flight later that morning. Captain Jessica Adams and First Lieutenant Brian Walsh were slated to take it up for pattern work, practicing the demanding transition between helicopter and airplane modes. That made the V-22 one of the most challenging aircraft in the military. Inventory. Riley had worked on dozens of pre-flight inspections, but she approached each one with the same methodical attention to detail that had earned her a reputation as one of the best Osprey mechanics on the East Coast. "You know, Patterson," Thompson said, settling onto a toolbox to watch her work. "I've been thinking about putting you in for the Advanced Propulsion Systems course at Patuxent River. You've got the aptitude for it. And frankly, we need more people who understand these birds at your level." Riley paused in her inspection, considering the offer. The course at Pax River was intensive, covering advanced diagnostics and repair techniques that would qualify her to work on the most complex Osprey systems. It was also a stepping stone toward potentially becoming a crew chief, responsible for the overall mechanical condition of specific aircraft. The opportunity represented everything she'd been working toward since joining the Corps. "I appreciate the recommendation, Gunny," she said finally. "But honestly, I'm happy where I am. I like hands-on work, figuring out what makes these machines tick. Not sure I want to spend more time behind a desk." Thompson chuckled. "That's what I figured you'd say. But Patterson, don't sell yourself short. You've got instincts about these aircraft that most people never develop. I've seen you diagnose problems that stumped engineers with twice your education." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Adams and Lieutenant Walsh, both looking alert despite the early hour. Adams was a compact woman with sharp eyes who'd earned her reputation as one of the squadron's most skilled pilots. Walsh was newer to the Osprey, having transitioned from conventional helicopters, but he was eager to prove himself in the more demanding tiltrotor environment. "Morning, Gunny. How's our bird looking?" Adams asked, pulling on her flight gloves as she approached the aircraft. "Patterson's giving her the full treatment," Thompson replied. "Should be ready for your flight in about 30 minutes. Riley emerged from beneath the engine nacelle, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "Just finishing up the hydraulic check, ma'am. Everything's looking good, but I want to run one more diagnostic on the flight control system before I sign off." Adams nodded, appreciating the thoroughness. She'd flown with aircraft that had been maintained by Riley before and knew that when Patterson cleared a bird for flight, it would perform exactly as advertised. The trust between pilot and maintainer was sacred in military aviation, a bond forged by the understanding that mechanical failure at altitude could mean death for everyone aboard. "Take your time," Adams said. "Better to catch any issues on the ground than discover them at 3,000 feet. Riley connected her diagnostic equipment to the flight control system, watching as streams of data flowed across her tablet screen. The V-22's fly-by-wire controls were incredibly sophisticated, using computer systems to manage the complex aerodynamics of transitioning between helicopter and airplane modes. Unlike simpler aircraft where pilots had direct mechanical control over flight surfaces, the Osprey relied on electronic signals, interpreted by flight computers that made thousands of adjustments per second. This complexity was what made the aircraft so capable, but it also meant that maintenance required a deep understanding of both mechanical and electronic systems. Riley had spent countless hours studying the technical manuals, learning how the various subsystems interacted and what subtle signs might indicate developing problems. The diagnostic check revealed what Riley had expected: all systems within normal parameters with no fault codes or anomalous readings. She disconnected her equipment and began the final visual inspection, walking around the aircraft to check for any obvious issues that computerized diagnostics might miss. The V-22 Osprey was an imposing machine, standing nearly 18 feet tall with its rotors folded and stretching 57 feet from nose to tail. Its twin Rolls-Royce turboshaft engines were capable of producing over 6,000 horsepower each, enough to lift the aircraft's maximum takeoff weight of nearly 60,000 pounds. The complexity was evident in every line of the machine, from the articulated wing that allowed the rotors to tilt from vertical to horizontal, to the sophisticated landing gear that could handle both helicopter-style vertical landings and conventional runway operations. Riley ran her hands along the leading edges of the rotors, checking for any nicks or damage that could affect performance. She inspected the hydraulic lines, electrical connections, and control linkages with the systematic approach that had become second nature over years of maintaining these aircraft. Every component was critical, and every inspection was an opportunity to prevent a failure that could cost lives. "All set, ma'am," Riley announced, stepping back from the aircraft. "She's ready to fly." Adams and Walsh began their own pre-flight inspection, a ritual that would take another 20 minutes as they verified that all systems were ready for flight. Riley watched them work, noting the professional competence that marked experienced aviators. These pilots would take her maintenance work and trust their lives to it, a responsibility that she never took lightly. "Patterson," Thompson called from the hangar office. "I just got word that we're getting priority tasking this afternoon. Gonna need 168,019 turned around quickly when Adams and Walsh get back." Riley walked over to the office where Thompson was, reviewing a message on his computer terminal. His expression was serious, the kind of look that meant the routine training day was about to become something more complex. "What kind of tasking?" Riley asked. "Search and rescue exercise, but with a twist. They want to test our rapid response capabilities for mountain rescue scenarios. We'll be flying support for a joint exercise with Army Special Operations out at Camp Leone's mountain warfare training area." Riley nodded, already mentally reviewing the additional checks and preparations that would be required. Mountain operations put additional stress on aircraft systems, particularly the engines and flight controls. The thin air and unpredictable weather patterns in mountainous terrain created challenges that required aircraft to be in perfect mechanical condition. "I'll start prepping for the mountain ops checklist," Riley said. "Want to make sure we're ready for whatever they throw at us." Thompson smiled. "That's why I put you on this bird, Patterson. You think 3 steps ahead." Outside the hangar, the morning sun was beginning to rise over the flat landscape of eastern North Carolina, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Riley could hear the distinctive sound of 168,019's engines spooling up as Adams and Walsh prepared for takeoff, the whine of the turboshafts building to the familiar howl that marked an Osprey coming to life. She watched as the massive aircraft taxied out of the hangar, its rotors tilted fully vertical for helicopter mode. The sight never got old for Riley, watching something she'd worked on with her own hands lift gracefully into the air, defying gravity through the precise interaction of thousands of mechanical and electronic components. The takeoff was smooth and professional, Adams transitioning the aircraft from hover to forward flight with the practiced ease that marked an experienced Osprey pilot. Riley tracked the aircraft's progress until it disappeared over the tree line, bound for the training area where Adams and Walsh would practice the demanding maneuvers that kept their skills sharp. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Beautiful morning for flying," Thompson observed, joining Riley in watching the aircraft's departure. "Yes, sir. It's going to be a good day." Riley had no way of knowing that in less than 6 hours, she would receive an emergency call that would change everything she thought she knew about her role in the Marine Corps. The routine mountain rescue exercise that Thompson had mentioned was about to become anything but routine. And the skills that Riley had developed maintaining V-22 Ospreys would be tested in ways that no training manual had ever anticipated. The emergency would begin with a simple communication from the mountain training area. A special operations team was in trouble, casualties were mounting, and the weather was deteriorating rapidly. What made the situation truly desperate was the location where the team had become trapped, a narrow canyon at high altitude where conventional helicopters couldn't operate and fixed-wing aircraft couldn't land. They would need someone who understood the V-22 Osprey better than anyone else, someone who knew exactly what the aircraft could and couldn't do, someone who might be able to coax impossible performance from a machine that was already operating at the very edge of its design limits. they would need Riley Patterson. Whether she was ready or not, the emergency alarm shattered the afternoon quiet of Hangar 7 at 13:47 hours. Its piercing wail cutting through the normal sounds of maintenance operations like a knife. Riley looked up from the avionics panel she'd been troubleshooting on a different Osprey, her wrench still in hand as the facility's overhead speakers crackled to life. All personnel, priority Alpha emergency. Report to operations immediately. This is not a drill. Riley had heard emergency calls before during her 6 years at Cherry Point, but something in the tone of the announcement sent a chill down her spine. Priority Alpha meant lives were in immediate danger, and the urgency in the duty officer's voice suggested this wasn't a standard search and rescue operation. She secured her tools and jogged toward the operations center, joining a stream of pilots, aircrew, and maintenance personnel, all moving with the same purposeful haste. The building buzzed with controlled chaos as personnel gathered around the large tactical display screen that dominated the main briefing room. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the squadron commander, stood at the front of the room with a grim expression that Riley had never seen before. Mitchell was known for her calm demeanor under pressure, a veteran of multiple combat deployments who'd earned the respect of everyone in the squadron. Seeing her this tense immediately told Riley that whatever had happened was serious. Listen up, people. At 13:15 hours, we lost contact with Recon Team Bravo during their mountain warfare exercise in the Blue Ridge sector. Their last transmission indicated they were under heavy simulated fire and taking casualties as part of the training scenario. However, 30 minutes ago, we received a partial emergency transmission on their backup frequency. Mitchell paused, her jaw tight with barely controlled emotion. The transmission was broken and difficult to understand, but we've determined that what we thought was a training exercise has become a real emergency. Team Bravo is trapped in a narrow canyon at coordinates that put them roughly 8,000 feet above sea level, and they have multiple actual casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Riley felt her stomach drop. 8,000 feet. In the Blue Ridge Mountains meant terrain that was notoriously difficult for aircraft operations. The canyons in that region were narrow, with unpredictable wind patterns, and surrounded by peaks that could create deadly downdrafts and turbulence. "Sir," called out Captain Rodriguez, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, "what about the extraction helicopters? Surely the Army has assets closer to the area." Mitchell's expression darkened further. The Army launched 2 UH-60 Black Hawks 45 minutes ago. Both aircraft were forced to abort their approaches due to extreme turbulence and downdrafts. In the canyon, one helicopter experienced a hard landing during the abort and is currently undergoing emergency repairs. The crew is uninjured, but the aircraft is down for at least 6 hours. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If experienced helicopter pilots in aircraft, specifically designed for difficult terrain, couldn't reach the trapped team, the situation was far worse than anyone had initially realized. "The weather is deteriorating rapidly," Mitchell continued. "A storm system moving in from the west is expected to make the area completely inaccessible by nightfall. We have approximately 4 hours of usable daylight, and after that, Team Bravo will be on their own until morning at the earliest." Riley found herself studying the tactical display more closely, noting the topographical details of the target area. The coordinates showed a canyon that was barely wide enough for a large aircraft, surrounded by peaks that rose another 1,000 feet on either side. The terrain looked like something out of a nightmare for any pilot, but as she studied the dimensions, a thought began forming in her mind. "Ma'am," said Captain Adams, who had returned from her morning training flight just 20 minutes earlier, "what are our options? Can we stage a ground rescue operation?" "Negative. The terrain is too steep and dangerous for ground access, especially with wounded personnel. The team rappelled into the canyon as part of their exercise, but the extraction." point they were supposed to use is now blocked by a landslide that occurred during the simulated firefight. Mitchell activated a detailed terrain map that showed the canyon in 3 dimensions. Riley studied it intently, her engineering mind automatically analyzing the challenge from a mechanical perspective. The canyon was roughly 40 feet wide, at its narrowest point, with vertical walls rising on both sides. Any aircraft attempting to land would have to descend straight down into what was essentially a vertical tube, with no room for error and no possibility of a traditional approach. Pattern. "Sir," called out Master Sergeant Kevin Brooks, the senior enlisted advisor, "what about fast roping or rappelling personnel down to provide medical assistance?" "We considered that, but the canyon walls are unstable. The geology reports indicate recent seismic activity in the area, and the simulated explosions from the training exercise may have loosened more rock. Dropping personnel into the canyon could trigger another landslide that would trap more people." Riley raised her hand tentatively, feeling somewhat out of place among the aircrew personnel, but unable to shake the idea that had been growing in her mind. "Ma'am, what are the exact dimensions of the canyon at the narrowest point?" Mitchell looked surprised to see a maintenance technician asking tactical questions, but she checked her notes. 42 feet wide, extending for approximately 300 feet in length. The floor is relatively flat, composed of packed sand and small rocks. Riley's pulse quickened as she did quick mental calculations. A V-22 Osprey had a rotor diameter of 38 feet in helicopter mode. That left only 2 feet of clearance on each side, but it was theoretically possible. The length of 300 feet was more than adequate for the aircraft's dimensions, and a flat, packed surface could support the Osprey's weight if the approach was executed perfectly. "Ma'am," Riley said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke, "I think a V-22 might be able to get in there." The room turned to look at her, and Riley suddenly felt very aware that she was a staff sergeant speaking up in a room full of officers and senior enlisted personnel. But Mitchell nodded for her to continue. "The rotor diameter gives us minimal clearance, but it's doable if the approach is perfectly vertical. The bigger challenge would be the downdrafts and turbulence, but the V-22's computer-controlled flight systems might be able to compensate better than a conventional helicopter." Captain Rodriguez shook his head immediately. "Patterson, I appreciate the thought, but that canyon is a death trap for any aircraft. The wind patterns alone would make it nearly impossible to maintain a stable hover, and one mistake means you're hitting the canyon walls with rotors spinning at full power." "With respect, sir," Riley replied, "the V-22's flight control computers make thousands of adjustments per second. In a confined space like that canyon, the aircraft's ability to automatically compensate for wind disturbances might actually work in our favor." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell studied Riley with new interest. "Sergeant Patterson, you're maintenance, not aircrew. What makes you think you understand the flight dynamics better than our pilots?" Riley felt heat rising in her cheeks but pressed on. "Ma'am, I've worked on these aircraft for 6 years. I know every system, every sensor, every limitation. I've read every technical manual, every flight test report, every accident investigation. The V-22 was designed to operate in environments that conventional aircraft can't handle." Captain Adams stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "Even if the aircraft could technically fit, the pilot workload would be enormous. Flying in that kind of confined space requires split-second reactions and perfect spatial awareness. One moment of disorientation and—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the consequences of a mistake at that altitude in such tight quarters. "Ma'am," Riley said, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to suggest, "I'd like to volunteer to attempt the mission." The room erupted in surprised murmurs, and Mitchell held up her hand for silence. "Sergeant, you're not pilot qualified on the V-22. You can't fly combat missions." "I'm not suggesting I fly it as an aircrew, ma'am. But I know these aircraft better than anyone else on this base. I understand their limits, their capabilities, and their quirks. If someone's going to attempt something this dangerous, shouldn't it be the person who knows the machine best? Rodriguez looked incredulous. Patterson, maintenance knowledge doesn't translate to flight skills. Flying an Osprey in combat conditions requires years of training and experience that you simply don't have. Riley had anticipated this objection and had been thinking through her response. Sir, with respect, this isn't about traditional flying skills. This is about understanding what the aircraft can do when pushed beyond normal parameters. I've seen these machines operate in test conditions that pilots said were impossible. She turned to address the room more broadly. I've read every flight test report from when they were developing the Osprey's capabilities. I know exactly how the flight control systems respond to extreme conditions, how much stress the airframe can handle, and what the actual margins of safety are versus what the conservative flight manuals say. Mitchell studied Riley carefully, clearly weighing options that all seemed impossible. Even if we were willing to consider this, Sergeant, you'd need a qualified pilot as aircraft commander. And no pilot is going to attempt a mission this dangerous with an unqualified crew member at the controls. Actually, ma'am, Captain Adams said slowly, there might be a way to make this work. All eyes turned to Adams, who was staring at the tactical display with the expression of someone working through a complex problem. The V-22 has dual controls, and in an emergency situation, a qualified pilot could talk an experienced maintainer through the basic control inputs while monitoring all flight systems. She paused, clearly thinking through the implications. Patterson knows the aircraft systems better than most pilots. If I was there to handle the complex flight planning and emergency procedures, she might be able to manage the basic control inputs needed for a vertical descent and landing. Riley felt a surge of hope, but Rodriguez was already shaking his head. Jessica, that's insane. You're talking about letting a maintenance tech fly a combat mission into the most dangerous terrain imaginable. Kevin's right, Brooks added. The liability alone would end careers. And if something goes wrong, 8 Marines die, Riley interjected, her voice carrying an edge of frustration. Sir, we're talking about people who are counting on us to figure this out. Maybe the approach is unconventional, but conventional approaches have already failed. Mitchell walked to the tactical display and studied the terrain features one more time. The silence in the room was thick with tension as everyone waited for her decision. Finally, she turned back to face the assembled personnel. Sergeant Patterson, what you're suggesting goes against every regulation and protocol we have. You're not qualified, not trained, and not authorized to fly combat missions. Riley's heart began to sink, but Mitchell wasn't finished. However, we have 8 Marines who are going to die if we don't do something extraordinary. Captain Adams, if you're willing to accept the risk and the responsibility, I'll authorize an emergency waiver for Sergeant Patterson to act as assistant pilot under your direct supervision. Adams nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am, I'll take full responsibility. Sir, Rodriguez protested, this is exactly the kind of cowboy decision-making that gets people killed. We should wait for better weather or more conventional assets. Mitchell's expression was grim but determined. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, those Marines don't have time for better weather. The storm front will make any rescue impossible for at least 24 hours, and their injuries require immediate medical attention. She turned to Riley. Sergeant, you've got 15 minutes to brief Captain Adams on every system limitation and capability you think might be relevant to this mission. I want you two to walk through every possible scenario and contingency. Riley felt a mixture of terror and determination coursing through her veins. This was beyond anything she'd ever imagined when she joined the Marines, but 8 lives were hanging in the balance. Ma'am, there's one more thing, Riley said. If we're going to do this, we need to modify the aircraft. Standard configuration won't work for what we're attempting. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. What kind of modifications? We need to strip out every non-essential piece of equipment to reduce weight. We'll need maximum power available for hovering in the thin mountain air. And I want to install additional proximity sensors if we have them available. Flying in a 42-foot corridor means we need every possible aid to avoid hitting the canyon walls. Adams was nodding as Riley spoke. She's right. Weight and power management will be critical at that altitude. How long for the modifications? Mitchell asked. Riley did quick mental calculations. 45 minutes if we have the parts, and I get a full maintenance crew helping. Do it. And Sergeant? Mitchell's voice carried both authority and concern. Don't make me regret this decision. As the briefing broke up and personnel scattered to their assigned tasks, Riley felt the full weight of what she'd volunteered for settling on her shoulders. In less than 2 hours, she would be attempting to fly a V-22 Osprey into terrain that experienced pilots said was impossible, with 8 lives depending on her understanding of a machine she'd never actually piloted. The theory had suddenly become terrifyingly real. The hangar transformed into controlled chaos as Riley assembled her modification team. She had 45 minutes to reconfigure a V-22 Osprey for a mission that pushed far beyond its standard operational parameters, and every second counted towards saving 8 trapped Marines. Corporal Martinez. Riley called out to her most skilled assistant, a young technician from El Paso who had an intuitive understanding of electrical systems. I need you to pull every non-essential electronic component from the cabin. Navigation displays we won't need, redundant communication equipment, passenger comfort systems, anything that draws power or adds weight. Martinez nodded and immediately began disconnecting equipment with practiced efficiency. Riley had chosen her team carefully, technicians who not only possessed the technical skills, but could work under extreme pressure without second-guessing. Orders. Staff Sergeant Williams, she addressed a burly mechanic who specialized in structural modifications. We need to remove 4 rows of standard seating and install emergency medical equipment tie-downs. The wounded Marines will need to be secured for transport, and we can't risk equipment shifting during flight. Williams was already pulling cutting tools from the equipment locker. How much weight reduction are we targeting, Patterson? Every pound we can shave. At 8,000 feet, the air density is about 25% lower than sea level. We need every bit of power margin we can get for hovering operations. While her team worked on the interior modifications, Riley focused on the most critical upgrade: installing additional proximity sensors. The standard V-22 had basic obstacle detection systems, but navigating a 42-foot wide canyon would require precision that went beyond normal specifications. Sergeant, First Class Daniel Park approached with an equipment case that contained experimental sensor arrays originally designed for urban warfare operations. Park was an avionics specialist who had previously worked with Special Operations Command, and his experience with non-standard aircraft modifications made him invaluable for this mission. Patterson, I pulled these proximity sensors from the experimental equipment depot, Park said, opening the case to reveal compact radar units no larger than a smartphone. They're designed for close-quarters maneuvering in urban environments, but they should give you real-time distance measurements to obstacles within 50 feet. Riley examined the sensors, her mind immediately grasping their potential. Can we integrate them with the flight display system? Not with the standard interfaces, but I can patch them through the auxiliary data bus. You'll get distance readings on the multifunction display, updated 10 times per second. Do it. And Park? I want sensors mounted on both sides of the aircraft and one facing forward. If we're going into that canyon, I need to know exactly how much clearance we have at all times. As Park began the complex process of integrating the non-standard equipment, Captain Adams appeared beside Riley with a flight helmet and survival gear. Adams had spent the past 20 minutes studying weather reports and terrain analysis, preparing for a mission unlike anything in her 8 years of Osprey operations. "Riley, we need to talk through the flight profile," Adams said, her expression serious but focused. "I've been analyzing the approach route, and there are some things you need to understand before we attempt this." They moved to a quiet corner of the hangar where Adams had set up a portable terrain mapping display. The three-dimensional representation of the target canyon looked even more intimidating in detail, showing the narrow corridor surrounded by jagged peaks that created a maze of potential wind patterns. "The approach has to be absolutely vertical," Adams explained, pointing to the canyon opening. "Any attempt at a conventional landing approach will put us into the canyon walls. We'll have to transition from airplane mode to helicopter mode while we're still above the canyon, then descend straight down like an elevator." Riley studied the display, visualizing the complex sequence of control inputs that would be required. "What about the wind patterns? Those peaks are going to create some nasty turbulence." "That's where it gets really complicated." "The weather analysis shows winds from the southwest in about 20 knots, but those peaks will create rotors and downdrafts that could vary by 40 knots or more. The aircraft's flight control computers will try to compensate, but they're not designed for this kind of extreme environment." Adams activated a simulation mode that showed predicted wind patterns based on the terrain. Riley watched as virtual arrows illustrated the chaotic air currents that would be swirling around their aircraft during the descent. "The good news," Adams continued, "is that once we're down inside the canyon, we should be somewhat protected from the worst turbulence. The bad news is that getting down there without hitting something is going to require perfect coordination between both of us. What do you need me to handle?" Riley asked, her engineering background helping her break the complex mission into manageable components. "Power management is going to be critical. The engines will be working at maximum output in the thin air, and I need you to monitor every system for signs of overheating or stress. You'll also be my eyes and ears for the proximity sensors. I'll be too busy with primary flight controls to process that information effectively." Riley nodded, understanding her role in the mission. While Adams handled the complex task of actually flying the aircraft, Riley would serve as a systems manager and safety monitor, using her deep knowledge of the Osprey's limitations to ensure they didn't push the machine beyond its breaking point. "There's something else," Adams added, lowering her voice. "If something goes wrong during the descent, if we lose an engine or hit severe turbulence, our options for recovery are extremely limited. The canyon is too narrow for auto-rotation, and there's no room for emergency maneuvering." The implications were clear. This mission was essentially a one-way commitment. Once they began the descent into the canyon, success was the only option that didn't result in disaster. "Understood," Riley replied. "What about the extraction?" "Getting out of that canyon is going to be just as challenging as getting in. Actually, extraction might be even harder. We'll be heavier with the wounded Marines aboard, and the engine performance will be degraded from operating at maximum power for an extended period. Plus, we'll be working against time. That storm system is moving in fast." Before Riley could respond, Gunnery Sergeant Thompson approached with a worried expression. "Patterson, I just got off the radio with the trapped team. Their situation is deteriorating faster than we thought." Riley felt her stomach tighten. "What's their status?" 3 Marines with serious injuries that require immediate surgery. 2 more with significant blood loss. The team medic is doing what he can, but he's running low on supplies, and some of the injuries are beyond field treatment capabilities. The news added another layer of urgency to an already desperate situation. Not only did they need to reach the trapped team, but they had to do it quickly enough for the wounded Marines to receive proper medical care. "How long do we have?" Adams asked. "The medic estimates that without proper treatment, we'll start losing people within 4 hours. And that's assuming no complications from shock or blood loss. Riley looked at her modification team, who were working with determined efficiency to prepare the aircraft. They were making good progress, but every minute spent on preparations was a minute closer to losing the Marines they were trying to save. Thompson, what's the status of medical personnel for the mission? That's another challenge. Hospital Corpsman First Class Jennifer Walsh volunteered to accompany the mission. She's trained in battlefield trauma care and can provide advanced medical support during the flight back. Riley knew Walsh by reputation, a Navy medic who had served multiple deployments with Marine units and was known for her ability to save lives under impossible conditions. Having her aboard would significantly improve the chances that the wounded Marines would survive the extraction and transport. Where is she now? Riley asked. Prepping medical equipment and coordinating with the surgical team that will be standing by when we return. As if summoned by their conversation, Walsh appeared carrying a compact medical kit designed for helicopter operations. She was a compact woman with steady hands and the kind of calm confidence that came from years of treating trauma patients in combat zones. Sergeant Patterson, Walsh said, I understand you're the one attempting to fly this mission. I need you to know what we're dealing with medically. Walsh opened her kit and showed Riley the specialized equipment she'd selected for the mission. We have 3 Marines with penetrating trauma that will require immediate surgical intervention. The longer we delay, the higher the risk of complications that could make their injuries fatal. What kind of medical support will you need during the flight? Riley asked. Stable power for monitoring equipment and climate control to prevent shock. These patients are going to be in critical condition, and any additional stress from temperature extremes or power fluctuations could kill them. Riley made mental notes about power management requirements. The aircraft's electrical systems would already be strained from operating the additional sensors and maximum engine output. Adding medical equipment would require careful balancing to ensure they didn't overload critical systems. Walsh, I need to know, what are the absolute minimum conditions you need to keep these Marines alive during transport? Pressurized cabin, temperature between 68 and 72 degrees, and uninterrupted power to the monitoring equipment. If we lose any of those for more than a few minutes, we could lose patients. The requirements added complexity to an already challenging mission, but Riley understood that successfully extracting the Marines meant nothing if they died during transport. She began mentally redesigning her power management strategy to accommodate the medical equipment requirements. Corporal Martinez, Riley called out, I need you to install dedicated power lines for medical equipment. Use the auxiliary generator circuit and make sure we have battery backup for at least 30 minutes. Martinez looked up from his work, removing unnecessary electronics. That's going to reduce our weight savings significantly, Sergeant. Do it anyway. What's the point of extracting wounded Marines if they die on the way home? As her team continued their modifications, Riley found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they were attempting. This mission represented a fundamental shift in how military operations might be conducted when conventional approaches failed. The idea of maintenance personnel taking on flight responsibilities was unprecedented, but it reflected the reality that modern military operations sometimes required innovative solutions to impossible problems. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Torres approached with a clipboard containing the final weight calculations for the modified aircraft. Torres was the squadron's loadmaster specialist, responsible for ensuring that aircraft weight and balance remained within safe parameters. Patterson, I've got the numbers for the modified configuration, Torres said. We've removed about 800 pounds of non-essential equipment, but the medical gear and additional sensors add back about 300 pounds. Net weight reduction is 500 pounds. Riley reviewed the calculations, checking them against the aircraft's performance charts for high-altitude operations. What's our maximum payload capacity for the target altitude? At 8,000 feet with current atmospheric conditions, maximum payload is about 6,400 pounds. 8 Marines plus medical equipment should be well within limits. But power requirements for hovering operations are going to be right at the edge of the envelope. The numbers confirmed what Riley already suspected. This mission would push the V-22 to its absolute limits. There would be no margin for error, and no backup plan if something went wrong. Torres, I want you to calculate exact fuel requirements for the mission profile. We need enough fuel to reach the target, hover for up to 15 minutes while we load casualties, and return to base with minimum reserves. Already on it. Based on the distance and hover requirements, we'll need to take off with about 80% fuel load. That gives us enough for the mission with standard reserves. As the modifications neared completion, Riley felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on her shoulders. In 20 minutes, she would be climbing into the cockpit of a heavily modified V-22 Osprey to attempt a rescue mission that experienced pilots considered impossible. The team she had assembled was working with precision and dedication that reflected the Marine Corps' values of adaptability and commitment to saving their fellow warriors. Each person had contributed specialized skills that made the mission possible, turning what seemed like an impossible challenge into a dangerous but achievable operation. Riley looked around the hangar at her unlikely team of allies, mechanics, avionics specialists, medical personnel, and pilots who had come together to solve a problem that conventional military doctrine said couldn't be solved. In 30 minutes, they would find out whether their innovation and determination were enough to bring 8 Marines home alive. The modified V-22 Osprey sat on the tarmac like a technological predator, its engines winding up with the distinctive whine that marked the beginning of what everyone hoped wouldn't be a suicide mission. Riley strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she ran through the pre-flight checklist that she had memorized, but never actually performed from the pilot's perspective. Captain Adams settled into the aircraft commander's seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had logged over 2,000 hours in V-22 operations. But even her experienced demeanor couldn't hide the tension that filled the cockpit as they prepared to attempt something that violated every conventional wisdom about rotorcraft operations. Riley, I need you to understand something before we take off, Adams said, her voice serious as she adjusted her flight controls. Once we commit to this mission, we're going to discover problems that we haven't anticipated. The question isn't whether something will go wrong. It's how we handle it when it does. Riley nodded, her engineering mind already working through contingency scenarios. The proximity sensors that Park had installed were displaying green status. Lights, the medical equipment was secured and powered, and all aircraft systems showed normal parameters. But she knew that normal parameters for ground operations meant nothing when they reached the extreme conditions of their destination. Radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the operations center. Rescue 77, this is Cherry. Point operations. We have updated intelligence from the target area that you need to hear before departure. Adams keyed her microphone. Cherry Point operations, Rescue 77 ready to copy. Rescue 77, be advised that aerial reconnaissance has identified additional complications at the target location. The landslide that trapped Team Bravo appears to have been more extensive than initially reported. The team is now isolated in a section of the canyon that's only 38 feet wide at the narrowest point. Riley felt ice form in her stomach. 38 feet was exactly the diameter of the V-22's rotors. That left zero margin for error. Even the slightest miscalculation would result in rotor blades striking canyon walls with catastrophic results. Operations. Confirm that measurement. Did you say 38 feet? Affirmative, Rescue 77. 38 feet at the narrowest point, extending for approximately 100 feet in length. The team is positioned at the far end of this restricted section. Adams looked at Riley with an expression that mixed concern with determination. That changes everything. We'll have to thread the needle through that narrow section to reach the casualties. Can we abort and reconsider our approach? Riley asked, though she already knew the answer. Negative. The weather window is closing faster than predicted. If we don't go now, we won't get another chance until tomorrow. And the medical officer says the casualties won't survive that long. Riley studied the additional sensor displays that Park had installed, noting that they would provide real-time measurements accurate to within 6 inches. In theory, the technology existed to navigate the narrow passage safely. In practice, they would be attempting something that no pilot had ever tried. Operations, what's the current status of Team Bravo? Adams asked. Rescue 77, the team medic reports that 2 Marines are now critical and require immediate surgical intervention. Blood loss is becoming severe, and field medical supplies are nearly exhausted. The urgency in the radio operator's voice underscored what everyone already knew. Delay meant death for the wounded Marines. Riley checked her watch and calculated that they had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining before the approaching storm system made flight operations impossible. Riley, Adams said, I need you to take us through every system that might fail during this mission. What are our most vulnerable points? Riley consulted her mental database of V-22 technical knowledge, focusing on the systems that would be stressed beyond normal parameters. Engine overheating is our biggest risk. We'll be running maximum power at high altitude for extended periods. The transmission system will also be stressed from the hovering operations. What are the warning signs I need to watch for? Engine temperature readings above normal operating range, transmission oil pressure fluctuations, and any unusual vibrations that could indicate mechanical stress. The flight control computers will try to compensate for system degradation, but there are limits to what they can handle. As they completed their pre-flight checks, Hospital Corpsman Walsh's voice came over the internal communications system from the cabin. Flight crew, medical equipment is secured and operational. I'm ready for patient transport. Riley turned to look back at the cabin, where Walsh had efficiently arranged the medical equipment and prepared spaces for 8 wounded Marines. The transformation of the aircraft's interior was remarkable. What had been passenger seating an hour earlier was now a flying trauma center equipped to handle critical casualties. Walsh, what's your assessment of the medical situation based on the latest reports? Adams asked. Captain, based on the field medic's descriptions, we're looking at least 2 Marines who will need immediate blood transfusions and surgical intervention. I've got the equipment to stabilize them during transport, but every minute of delay increases the risk of losing them. The medical pressure added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous mission. Not only did they need to successfully navigate treacherous terrain and execute a precision landing, but they had to do it quickly enough to save lives that were hanging by increasingly thin threads. Rescue 77, you are cleared for takeoff. Came the air traffic control authorization. Wind is 270 at 15 knots, visibility 10 miles, ceiling unlimited. Good luck. Adams pushed the throttles forward, and Riley felt the familiar sensation of the V-22's engines building power. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, transitioning from ground operations to the element where it truly belonged. As they climbed away from Cherry Point, Riley could see the storm system approaching from the west, dark clouds that promised the kind of weather that would make their return flight even more challenging. Flight time to target is 47 minutes, Adams announced over the intercom. We'll use the transit time to run through emergency procedures and backup plans. As they flew toward the mountains, Riley found herself studying the aircraft systems with new intensity. Every gauge, every indicator, every warning light took on critical importance when she realized that her understanding of these machines might be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The proximity sensors were functioning perfectly, displaying clear readings of their distance from terrain features as they flew over the North Carolina countryside. Riley watched the numbers change as they passed over hills and valleys, gaining confidence in the technology that would be essential for navigating the narrow canyon. "Riley, I want you to understand something about what we're going to attempt," Adams said as they approached the mountain region. "The flight control computers are designed to prevent pilots from exceeding safe operational parameters. In that canyon, we're going to push beyond those parameters intentionally." "What does that mean practically?" "It means the computers are going to fight us. They'll try to prevent maneuvers that they calculate as dangerous, even though those maneuvers might be necessary for mission success. You need to be ready to override safety systems if I tell you to." Riley felt a chill of responsibility. The idea of deliberately disabling safety systems went against every instinct she'd developed as a maintenance technician, but she understood that this mission existed outside normal operational boundaries. "How will I know when to override the systems?" "I'll call out specific actions, but you need to watch for situations where the flight computers are preventing necessary control inputs. If we're descending into that canyon and the computers try to arrest our descent because they calculate we're too close to terrain, you'll need to override that function." The concept of fighting against the very systems designed to keep them safe seemed paradoxical, but Riley understood the logic. The V-22's computers were programmed for normal flight operations, not for deliberately flying into a canyon barely wider than the aircraft's rotor diameter. As they approached the target area, Riley could see the terrain features that made this mission so dangerous. The mountains rose dramatically from the surrounding landscape, their peaks shrouded in clouds that indicated the turbulent air conditions they would soon encounter. "There's the canyon," Adams said, pointing to a narrow cut in the mountainside that looked impossibly small from their current altitude. "We'll make one reconnaissance pass to assess conditions, then commit to the approach." Riley studied the canyon through binoculars, trying to visualize how their aircraft would fit into such a confined space. The walls were nearly vertical, composed of gray rock that looked unforgiving and solid. There was no room for error, no possibility of a second chance if something went wrong. "Rescue 77, this is Cherry Point Operations with updated weather information. Go ahead, Operations. Be advised that ground winds in the target area are now gusting to 30 knots with significant turbulence reported. The storm system is moving faster than predicted, and your weather window may be shorter than originally calculated." Adams absorbed this information grimly. "Operations, what's our current time limit for the mission?" "Rescue 77, recommend mission completion within 90 minutes. After that, weather conditions will make the return flight extremely hazardous. 90 minutes to locate the team, navigate the narrow canyon, load 8 wounded Marines, and fly back to base through deteriorating weather conditions." Riley realized that they were racing against multiple clocks simultaneously: the medical condition of the wounded Marines, the approaching storm, and the mechanical limits of their modified aircraft. "Riley, we're about to find out if our modifications and planning were adequate," Adams said as they began their descent toward the canyon. "Are you ready for this?" Riley checked the proximity sensors one final time, verified that all aircraft systems were functioning normally, and thought about the 8 Marines who were depending on their success. "I'm ready." But as they approached the canyon entrance, Riley saw something that made her blood run cold. The reconnaissance photos had been taken from directly above, showing the canyon as a simple straight cut in the mountainside. From their current angle, she could see that the canyon actually curved slightly about halfway through its length, a detail that hadn't been apparent in the overhead imagery. The curve meant that they would have to navigate not just a narrow passage, but a narrow passage with a blind turn that could hide obstacles or changes in width. Their mission had just become significantly more complicated, and they were already committed to an approach that left no room for additional challenges. Adams, do you see the curve in the canyon? Captain Adams studied the terrain ahead and immediately understood the implications. That's not in any of our intelligence reports. We're going in blind. As they prepared for the most dangerous approach of their lives, Riley realized that they had moved far beyond the realm of calculated risks into something that resembled controlled desperation. But 8 Marines were counting on them, and turning back was no longer an option. The V-22 Osprey hung suspended 300 feet above the canyon entrance, its rotors beating against air that seemed to fight back with invisible fists of turbulence. Riley's eyes were locked on the proximity sensors as Captain Adams maneuvered the aircraft into position for what would either be the most precise flying of their careers or their final moments alive. Proximity sensors showing 22 feet. To the left canyon wall, 19 feet to the right, Riley called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. We're offset from the center by about 18 inches. Adams made minute adjustments to the aircraft's position, fighting the unpredictable wind currents that swirled around the canyon entrance like invisible whirlpools. The storm system approaching from the west was already affecting local weather patterns, creating downdrafts and crosswinds that threatened to push them into the unforgiving rock walls. Flight controls are responding normally, but I'm getting significant buffeting from wind shear, Adams reported. Riley, I need you to monitor engine parameters closely. We're going to be at maximum power throughout this approach. Riley's eyes swept across the engine temperature gauges, transmission oil pressure indicators, and rotor RPM displays. Everything showed green, but she knew that operating at these extreme parameters meant they were walking a tightrope with no safety net. Rescue 77, this is Team Bravo Actual, crackled a weak radio transmission from somewhere deep in the canyon below. We can hear your rotors. Our position is approximately 300 meters into the canyon, past the curve you'll encounter. About halfway through, Riley felt relief knowing that the trapped Marines were still alive and able to communicate. But the reference to their position past the curve confirmed her worst fears about the complexity of the approach they were about to attempt. Team Bravo, this is Rescue 77, Adams replied. We're beginning our descent now. Have your casualties prepared for immediate evacuation. Our window for extraction is extremely limited. Roger, Rescue 77. Be advised that we have visual contact with falling rocks from the canyon walls. The structural integrity of this area appears to be compromised. The news about falling rocks added another deadly variable to an already impossible equation. Not only did they have to navigate a passage barely wider than their aircraft, but they had to do it while avoiding debris that could damage their rotors. Or, worse, trigger a larger rockfall that could bury both the rescue aircraft and the Marines they were trying to save. Beginning descent, Adams announced over the intercom. Hospital Corpsman Walsh, prepare for a rapid loading sequence. We won't have much time on the ground. Riley felt her stomach drop as the aircraft began its vertical descent into the canyon. The sensation was like riding an elevator into hell, with rock walls rising on both sides as they sank deeper into the narrow passage. The proximity sensors provided a constant stream of information that Riley relayed to Adams in clipped, professional tones. 15 feet to the port wall, 17 feet to starboard. The descent rate looks good. The wind patterns inside the canyon were even more chaotic than Riley had anticipated. Downdrafts from the canyon rim mixed with updrafts created by the aircraft's own rotor wash, resulting in a turbulent soup of air that threatened to slam them into the walls without warning. Flight control computers are trying to arrest our descent, Adams called out, strain evident in her voice as she fought both the aircraft's safety systems and the hostile environment. They're detecting proximity to terrain and attempting to prevent what they calculate as an imminent collision. Do you want me to override the terrain avoidance system? Riley asked, her hand hovering over the controls that would disable one of the V-22 V-22's most important safety features. Not yet. Let me see if I can work with the system rather than against it. Riley watched Adams's skilled hands making constant adjustments to the flight controls, coaxing the reluctant aircraft deeper into the canyon through a combination of technical expertise and sheer determination. The Osprey was designed to be flown by computers with human oversight, but this mission required human instincts to override computer logic. Approaching the curve, Adams announced as they descended past a rock outcropping that marked the halfway point of their journey into the canyon. Visibility beyond this point is completely blocked. We're flying blind. Riley studied the proximity sensors as their only source of navigation information. The right wall of the canyon was curving away from them, while the left wall maintained its distance. She tried to visualize the three-dimensional shape of the passage they were entering, using the sensor data to build a mental map of their path. The right wall is opening up. Distance increasing to 25 feet, she reported. Left wall holding steady at 15 feet. We're following the curve successfully. As they rounded the bend, Riley caught her first glimpse of the trapped Marines. 8 figures in combat gear were positioned in a small area where the canyon widened slightly, creating a natural landing zone that was barely large enough for their aircraft. Several of the Marines were lying motionless, attended by their medic, who looked up at the approaching Osprey with an expression of desperate hope. "Target acquired," Adams announced. "Beginning final approach to landing zone." The landing area was perhaps 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, adequate for the V-22's dimensions, but requiring absolute precision in positioning. The rocky floor appeared reasonably level, but Riley could see debris from recent rockfalls scattered around the perimeter. "Proximity sensors showing obstacles on the ground," Riley called out, identifying chunks of rock that could damage the aircraft's landing gear or block their takeoff. The largest debris appears to be about 2 feet high, positioned near the center of the landing zone. Adams maneuvered the aircraft to avoid the obstacles while maintaining adequate clearance from the canyon walls. Riley watched the engine temperature gauges climb steadily as the turboshaft engines worked at maximum output to maintain controlled flight in the thin mountain air. "Engine tongue approaching redline," Riley warned. "We're getting close to thermal limits. How much time do we have before we risk engine damage?" Riley consulted her technical knowledge and the current operating parameters. "At these temperatures, maybe 15 minutes before we start seeing performance degradation. 20 minutes maximum before we risk catastrophic failure." The time constraint meant they would have to execute the rescue with military precision. Load the casualties, complete pre-flight checks, and depart, all within a window that leaves no room for complications or delays. "Team Bravo, this is Rescue 77. We're landing now. Have your casualties ready for immediate loading." The final approach required Adams to thread the aircraft between rock walls while compensating for the ground effect created by their rotor wash bouncing off the canyon floor. Riley called out proximity warnings as they descended the final 30 feet, her voice providing the constant stream of information that Adams needed to avoid disaster. 10 feet to ground contact. Left wall distance holding at 14 feet. The right wall is 20 feet. The landing was remarkably smooth considering the hostile environment, with the V-22's main landing gear settling onto the rocky surface with barely a bump. But Riley knew that the hardest part of their mission was still ahead, loading 8 casualties and departing from a confined space with deteriorating weather conditions. "Engines remaining at flight idle," Adams announced. "We're not shutting down. This is a hot extraction." Riley unbuckled from her seat and moved toward the cabin, where Walsh was already preparing to assist with loading the wounded Marines. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the rescue team moving with urgent efficiency, carrying stretchers toward the waiting Osprey. "Riley," Adams called out, "I need you to monitor all systems while we're loading. If anything shows signs of failure, we need to know immediately." The first casualty was loaded within 30 seconds of landing, a Marine with obvious chest trauma who was unconscious but breathing. Walsh immediately began connecting monitoring equipment and checking vital signs as the next stretcher was brought aboard. "This one's critical," the team medic shouted over the engine noise. "Massive internal bleeding. He needs surgery within the hour or we're going to lose him." Rayleigh felt the weight of responsibility settling heavier on her shoulders. Not only did they need to successfully extract from this impossible location, but they had to do it fast enough to save a life that was measured in minutes rather than hours. The loading process continued with practiced efficiency, but Riley could see the strain on everyone involved. The team medic and Walsh worked together to stabilize each casualty while the remaining Marines prepared equipment and cleared debris from around the aircraft. "Engine temperature climbing," Riley called out as she monitored the aircraft systems. "We're now at redline limits. Much longer and we risk thermal damage." "How many more casualties?" Adams asked. "4 more to load," came the reply from Walsh. Rayleigh calculated their remaining time margin and realized they were cutting dangerously close to the limits of both their aircraft and the medical conditions of their patients. Every second of delay increased the risk of engine failure or losing the critical casualty who needed immediate surgery. As the 6th Marine was loaded aboard, Riley noticed something that made her blood run cold. Small rocks were beginning to fall from the canyon walls, apparently dislodged by the vibrations from their rotor wash. What started as a few pebbles was becoming a steady shower of debris that threatened to damage their aircraft or injure the rescue personnel. "We're triggering a rockfall," Riley announced. "The rotor wash is destabilizing the canyon walls." Adams looked up at the canyon rim where larger rocks were beginning to shift ominously. "How much time do we need to complete loading?" 2 more casualties, maybe 3 minutes." "We don't have 3 minutes. The rockfall is accelerating." Riley watched in horror as a boulder the size of a car broke free from the canyon wall and crashed into the floor barely 50 feet from their aircraft. The impact sent up a cloud of dust and debris that temporarily obscured their vision and demonstrated the deadly potential of their environment. "All stop," Adams commanded. "Everyone needs to get aboard now, ready or not." The remaining 2 Marines were loaded in record time, with their teammates literally throwing equipment into the aircraft rather than risk the time needed for careful securing. Riley could hear larger rocks impacting around them as the canyon walls began what looked like the beginning of a major collapse. "Everyone aboard, preparing for immediate departure," Adams announced. Riley strapped herself back into the co-pilot's seat as Adams began the complex process of transitioning from ground operations to vertical takeoff. The engine temperatures were now well beyond normal operating limits, but they had no choice but to continue operation and hope the machinery held together long enough to clear the canyon. "Pulling power for takeoff," Adams announced. "Riley, if we lose an engine during this climb, we're not going to make it out." As the V-22 lifted off from the canyon floor, Riley realized they had crossed the point of no return. Success was now their only option for survival, and the margin for error had shrunk to essentially zero. 8 wounded Marines, 2 aircrew, and 1 medic were now completely dependent on Riley's understanding of the aircraft's limits and Adams's skill at pushing those limits beyond what anyone had thought possible. The real test was just beginning. The V-22 Osprey clawed its way upward through the collapsing canyon, like a mechanical phoenix rising from stone and chaos. Riley's hands flew across the instrument panel, managing a dozen critical systems simultaneously, while massive boulders crashed into the canyon floor behind them, with thunderous impacts that she could feel through the aircraft's airframe. "Engine 1 temperature critical, approaching damage threshold," Riley called out, watching the gauge needle swing into the red zone that marked potential catastrophic failure. "Engine 2 holding at redline but stable." Captain Adams fought the controls as the aircraft bucked and rolled in the turbulent air, created by falling rock and chaotic wind patterns. The proximity sensors were screaming warnings as canyon walls flashed past their rotor tips with clearances, measured in inches rather than feet. "I need more power to clear the canyon rim," Adams shouted over the howl of engines running beyond their design limits. "Can we push the thermal envelope further?" Riley's engineering knowledge warred with the immediate reality of their situation. Every technical manual, every safety protocol she'd ever studied, said that continuing to operate engines at these temperatures would result in mechanical failure. But the alternative was crashing into the canyon they were trying to escape. "Theoretically, we have maybe 2 more minutes before metal fatigue causes blade deformation," Riley replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "After that, we risk complete engine failure. 2 minutes to clear the canyon and reach a safe altitude," Adams calculated grimly. "We're going to find out if theory matches reality." In the cabin behind them, Hospital Corpsman Walsh worked frantically to stabilize the most critical patient while the aircraft pitched and rolled through the violet air. The Marine with internal bleeding had lost consciousness during the ascent, and his vital signs were deteriorating rapidly despite Walsh's best efforts. "I'm losing him," Walsh called out over the intercom. "Blood pressure is dropping fast. I need stable flight conditions to get IN-4 established." Riley realized they were facing an impossible choice: maintain the aggressive climb rate necessary to escape the canyon, or level off to provide the stable platform Walsh needed to save a life. Either decision carried the risk of losing everyone. "Aboard, how long do you need?" Adams asked. 30 seconds of stable flight to establish IV access. After that, I can work in turbulence." Adams looked at Riley with an expression that conveyed the weight of command decisions made in seconds rather than hours. "Can the engines handle 30 seconds of increased power for a rapid climb to clear altitude?" Riley studied the engine parameters, calculating thermal stress against time and power requirements. The mathematics were brutal, but there might be a narrow window where they could achieve both objectives. "If we reduce rotor RPM by 5% and increase collective pitch, we can maintain climb rate while reducing engine load slightly," Riley suggested. "It's risky because we'll be closer to stall conditions, but it might give Walsh the stable platform she needs. Do it." Riley's hands moved across the controls with precision born from 6 years of understanding these machines better than anyone else. She reduced rotor speed and adjusted the collective pitch controls, feeling the aircraft's flight characteristics change as it balanced on the knife edge between optimal performance and aerodynamic disaster. The aircraft stabilized noticeably, providing Walsh the few seconds she needed to establish 4 access for the critical patient. Riley watched the engine temperatures drop slightly from their peak levels, buying them precious additional operating time. 4 established, patient stabilizing, Walsh reported with relief evident in her voice. "Resuming emergency climb," Adams announced, pushing the throttles forward again as they approached the canyon rim. As they climbed above the rocky walls that had nearly become their tomb, Riley caught her first glimpse of the approaching storm system. What had been distant dark clouds an hour earlier was now a massive wall of turbulence and precipitation bearing down on their position with the inevitability of a natural disaster. "The storm front is closer than predicted," Riley observed, studying the threatening sky ahead. "We're going to be flying through severe weather on our return route." "Flight time to Cherry Point is 38 minutes, Adams calculated. "Will the engines hold together for that long at reduced power settings?" Riley consulted her technical knowledge and the current engine parameters. Operating at high power for extended periods created cumulative stress that could lead to sudden, catastrophic failure without warning. But reducing power too much would leave them vulnerable to the storm conditions they would have to penetrate. "We need to transition to airplane mode as soon as possible," Riley decided. "Forward flight is more efficient than hovering, and it will reduce thermal stress on the engines." Adams began the complex process of transitioning the V-22 from helicopter mode to airplane configuration, tilting the massive rotors forward to provide thrust rather than lift. The maneuver required careful coordination of multiple control systems while maintaining enough altitude to clear the mountain peaks surrounding them. Transition complete, Adams announced as the aircraft accelerated into forward flight, engine temperatures dropping to acceptable levels. Riley felt a moment of relief as the thermal crisis eased, but she knew they were far from safe. The storm system ahead promised its own set of challenges, and they still had 8 wounded Marines whose medical conditions were hanging in the balance. Rescue 77, this is Cherry Point Operations, crackled the radio. Be advised that weather conditions at base are deteriorating rapidly. We're experiencing wind gusts of 45 knots and heavy precipitation. Recommend you consider alternate landing sites. Riley felt her heart sink. After everything they'd endured to extract the wounded Marines, the possibility of being unable to land at their home base seemed like a cruel twist of fate. Operations, what alternates are available? Adams asked. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base is reporting better conditions, but they don't have the medical facilities to handle trauma cases. New Bern Regional has adequate medical support, but limited runway length for V-22 operations. Adams looked at Rayleigh for input. As the person most familiar with the aircraft's capabilities, her assessment of landing options could determine whether their rescued Marines received the medical care they desperately needed. New Bern's runway is adequate for emergency landing, Riley said after consulting her mental database of airfield specifications. The approach will be challenging in these weather conditions, but it's doable. What about the medical facilities? Walsh interjected from the cabin. My critical patient needs immediate surgery. Any delay could be fatal. Rayleigh realized they faced another impossible decision. Attempt a dangerous landing at Cherry Point where advanced medical facilities waited, or choose a safer landing at New Bern and risk losing a patient during ground transport to proper medical care. Before anyone could respond, the aircraft was suddenly buffeted by turbulence so severe that it felt like being inside a paint shaker. The leading edge of the storm system had reached them, bringing with it the kind of weather that made experienced pilots consider alternative careers. Severe turbulence, Adams announced unnecessarily as she fought to maintain controlled flight. We're entering the storm system. Rain began pelting the windscreen with such intensity that visibility dropped to near zero. Lightning flashed around them with frightening frequency, each discharge creating electromagnetic interference that affected their navigation and communication systems. Radio contact with operations is breaking up, Riley reported as static filled their headsets. We're on our own for the navigation and landing approach. The aircraft pitched and rolled through air that seemed determined to tear it apart, but Riley noted with satisfaction that all engine parameters remained stable. The modifications they'd made and the careful power management were paying dividends when it mattered most. I can see lights ahead, Adams called out, peering through the storm-lashed windscreen. That should be New Bern Regional. Riley studied the navigation display, confirming their position relative to the airport. They were approaching from the northeast, which would require a straight-in approach to the main runway. In clear weather, it would be a routine landing. In their current conditions, it would be another test of skill and determination. Fuel state is getting critical, Riley warned as she monitored the fuel gauges. We've burned more than calculated, due to the high power operations and storm penetration. How much flight time remaining? Maybe 10 minutes at current consumption rates. Adams absorbed this information grimly. They would have one chance to land successfully at New Bern, a missed approach or go around would leave them with insufficient fuel to reach any alternate airfield. New Bern Tower, this is Marine Rescue 77 with emergency medical evacuation. Adams transmitted on the emergency frequency. Request immediate clearance for straight-in approach, runway 36. The response came through heavy static. Rescue 77, New Bern Tower. You are cleared for emergency approach runway 36. Be advised winds are 270 at 35 gusting to 50 knots. Emergency services are standing by. The crosswind conditions were at the edge of what the V-22 could handle safely, especially with the aircraft modifications and current weather. Riley checked that all systems were prepared for what would likely be a very aggressive landing approach. Hospital. Corporal Walsh, secure all patients and equipment for hard landing. Adams commanded. This is going to be rough. As they descended through the storm toward the barely visible runway lights, Riley realized that everything they'd accomplished in the canyon would be meaningless if they couldn't safely deliver their patients to medical care. The climactic test wasn't just about escaping the mountains. It was about completing the mission despite every obstacle the environment could throw at them. Final approach, Adams announced as the runway materialized through the storm like a strip of salvation. Riley, I need you to call out our approach parameters. If we get low or off center line, we won't get a second chance. Riley focused on the approach display, providing Adams the precise information she needed to guide their heavily loaded aircraft through some of the worst weather conditions either of them had ever experienced. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of nature unleashed, but inside the cockpit, two people worked with the precision of a well-calibrated machine to bring 8 wounded Marines home alive. The landing would either be the culmination of an impossible rescue mission or the final chapter in a tragedy that had begun in a distant mountain canyon. As the runway rose to meet them through the chaos of wind and rain, Riley understood that the next 60 seconds would determine not just their survival, but whether the extraordinary risks they'd taken had been justified by success. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd sacrificed, came down to this moment of truth. The V-22 Osprey touched down on the rain-soaked runway at New Bern Regional Airport with a jarring impact that sent spray cascading in all directions. Riley felt the landing gear absorb the shock of their aggressive approach as Captain Adams fought the crosswinds that tried to push them off the center line even after touchdown. Main gear down and locked, we're on the ground, Adams announced with barely controlled relief as she applied brakes and reverse thrust to slow their momentum on the slick runway surface. Riley's hands were shaking as she began the engine shutdown procedures, her body finally releasing the tension that had sustained her through the most demanding hours of her life. Through the windscreen, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward their position, their flashing lights cutting through the storm like beacons of hope. Hospital Corporal Walsh, medical teams are approaching, Riley called out over the intercom. How are our patients? A critical patient is stable but needs immediate surgical intervention, Walsh replied, her voice hoarse from shouting over engine noise for the past hour. The others are in serious but manageable condition. We got them here in time. As the engines wound down and the rotor blades slowed to a stop, Riley realized that they had actually succeeded. 8 wounded Marines who had been trapped in an impossible location were now within reach of the medical care they desperately needed. The mission that everyone had said was suicide had somehow become the rescue operation that would define her career. Emergency medical teams swarmed the aircraft. The moment it was safe to approach, transferring patients with the practiced efficiency of trauma professionals. Riley watched through her side window as the Marine with critical internal injuries was rushed toward a waiting ambulance, surrounded by medical personnel who would continue the fight to save his life that Walsh had begun in the mountains. Sergeant Patterson, Captain Adams said as they completed the post-flight checklist, what you did today goes beyond anything they teach in any school or training program. You saved 8 lives through sheer determination and technical expertise. Riley felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished, but also acutely aware of how close they had come to disaster at every stage of the mission. Ma'am, We all saved those lives. I just happened to know the aircraft well enough to push it beyond normal limits. No, Riley. What you did was understand that sometimes normal limits are just suggestions when lives are on the line. You saw possibilities that experienced pilots missed, and you had the courage to act on that knowledge. As they secured the aircraft and gathered their equipment, Riley reflected on how dramatically her role had changed in the span of a single day. That morning, she had been Staff Sergeant Riley Patterson, maintenance technician, focused on routine inspections and equipment repairs. Tonight, she was someone who had proven that expertise and determination could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell arrived at the aircraft within an hour of their landing, accompanied by a small convoy of vehicles. That included medical personnel, maintenance crews, and what appeared to be several senior officers Riley didn't recognize. The squadron commander's expression was a mixture of relief, pride, and something that looked like amazement. "Sergeant Patterson, Captain Adams," Mitchell said as they climbed down from the aircraft, "I need to hear everything about this mission. What you accomplished today is going to change how we think about rescue operations and crew utilization." As they moved into the airport terminal for debriefing, Riley caught sight of herself in a mirror and was startled by what she saw. Her flight suit was stained with hydraulic fluid and sweat. Her hair was disheveled from the flight helmet, and her eyes carried the intensity of someone who had faced extreme challenges and emerged victorious. She looked like a pilot. The debriefing session lasted until well past midnight, with Riley providing detailed technical analysis of every system modification and operational decision that had made the mission possible. The senior officers asked probing questions about engine performance, flight control behavior, and the limits of what the V-22 could accomplish under extreme conditions. "Sergeant, your understanding of this aircraft's capabilities appears to exceed that of most qualified pilots," observed Colonel James Harrison, who had introduced himself as representing the Pentagon Special Operations Aviation Command. "Have you ever considered transitioning to flight training?" Riley paused, considering a possibility that had never seriously occurred to her before that day. "Sir, I've always been focused on the maintenance side of aviation. I like understanding how things work at the component level. What if I told you that we need pilots who understand aircraft systems at your level of detail?" Colonel Harrison continued. "Special operations require people who can push equipment beyond normal parameters when the mission demands it. Today proved that you have both the technical knowledge and the judgment to do exactly that." Captain Adams leaned forward in her chair. "Riley, what you did today demonstrates pilot skills that can't be taught in conventional training programs. You have an intuitive understanding of aircraft limitations that most pilots never develop." The conversation continued for another hour, with various officers describing opportunities in flight training, special operations aviation, and experimental test programs. Riley listened with growing interest as she realized that her unusual combination of technical expertise and operational experience might be exactly what certain military aviation programs needed. 3 weeks later, Riley found herself standing in the office of the Commandant of the Marine Corps at Headquarters Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. The walls were lined with photographs of marine aviation history, from early biplanes to the most advanced rotorcraft in the world. Among them was a new photograph showing a V-22 Osprey on the ground at New Bern Regional Airport, surrounded by medical personnel transferring wounded Marines to waiting ambulances. "Staff Sergeant Patterson," the Commandant said, "your actions during the Blue Ridge rescue operation represent the finest traditions of Marine Corps aviation. You demonstrated that innovation, expertise, and courage can overcome obstacles that conventional thinking considers impossible." Riley stood at attention, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention her actions had generated. The rescue mission had been covered by national media, and she had received commendation letters from senior officials throughout the Department of Defense. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Those Marines needed help, and we found a way to provide it." "Sergeant, you redefined what your job means for maintenance personnel throughout the military. You proved that technical expertise can be just as valuable in the cockpit as traditional pilot training, especially when dealing with crisis situations." The commandant handed her a thick folder containing orders that would change the trajectory of her military career. "You're being accepted into an accelerated flight training program designed specifically for personnel with advanced technical backgrounds. Upon completion, you'll be assigned to the Marine Corps' Special Operations Command as a pilot specializing in high-risk rescue operations." Riley opened the folder and scanned the documents that would transform her from a maintenance technician into a pilot qualified for the most demanding missions in military aviation. The program would build on her existing technical knowledge while teaching her the advanced flight skills needed for special operations. "Sir, what about the Marines we rescued? How are they doing?" The commandant smiled, the first time Riley had seen him express anything other than official seriousness. All 8 Marines made full recoveries. The Marine with critical injuries required multiple surgeries, but he's back on duty with his unit. They all specifically requested to meet with you before you begin flight training. 6 months later, Captain Riley Patterson, recently promoted and newly graduated from the Accelerated Flight Training Program, stood beside a V-22 Osprey on the flight line at Marine Corps Air Station New River. The aircraft bore the distinctive markings of Marine Special Operations Squadron VMM 266, and she was preparing for her first mission as aircraft commander. Her co-pilot was First Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent graduate of conventional flight training who had specifically requested an assignment to work with Riley. Kim represented a new generation of pilots who understood that the future of military aviation would require both traditional flight skills and deep technical expertise. "Ma'am, pre-flight inspection is complete," reported Corporal Jackson, Riley's crew chief. "All systems are green and ready for the mission." Riley smiled at the formality, remembering when she had been the one conducting pre-flight inspections while pilots prepared for takeoff. Now she was the pilot, but her maintenance background gave her a perspective on aircraft operations that enhanced rather than replaced traditional flight training. "Thank you, Corporal. What's our passenger manifest for today's mission?" 12 Special Operations personnel conducting mountain warfare training in Colorado. They specifically requested transport by the crew that pioneered the Blue Ridge rescue techniques. As Riley settled into the pilot's seat and began the familiar routine of engine start and systems checks, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that afternoon when emergency alarms had shattered the quiet of Hangar 7. The technical knowledge that had made her an exceptional maintenance technician had evolved into the foundation for a new approach to military aviation. The mission they were about to fly would take them to mountainous terrain, similar to where her aviation career had truly begun. But this time she would be there as a pilot with unique qualifications for operations that conventional aircraft couldn't attempt. The lessons learned from the Blue Ridge rescue had been incorporated into new training programs and operational procedures that were changing how the military approached impossible missions. "Tower, this is Marine 6-4 requesting clearance for departure," Riley transmitted as she completed the pre-takeoff checklist. "Marine 6-4, you are cleared for takeoff. Safe flight, Captain Patterson." As the V-22 lifted off into the clear morning sky, Riley understood that she had found her true calling through circumstances that no career counselor could have predicted. The maintenance technician who had volunteered for an impossible mission had become a pilot specializing in operations that pushed both aircraft and crews beyond conventional limits. She was no longer just someone who fixed aircraft so that others could fly them. She was someone who understood machines so thoroughly that she could coax impossible performance from them when lives hung in the balance. The technical expertise that had started as a fascination with complex machinery had evolved into the ability to save lives through innovation and determination. Below them, the landscape of North Carolina stretched toward distant mountains where 8 Marines had once waited for a rescue that everyone said was impossible. Today, those same techniques that had made the impossible achievable were being taught to a new generation of pilots and crew members who would face their own impossible missions in the future. Riley Patterson had discovered that sometimes the most important transformations in life come not from following a planned career path, but from being willing to step beyond the boundaries of what you think you're capable of when others are counting on you. The maintenance technician who had become a pilot was proof that expertise, courage, and determination could redefine the possible when applied with wisdom and skill. In the end, she had learned that being just maintenance was never a limitation. It was preparation for the moment when technical mastery and human courage would be needed to achieve what others considered impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.